And we are live. I'm going to start letting folks in. We have 14 in the waiting room. They all just flew in, so I'm letting them in.
Cool. Welcome, everyone. It's good to see everybody. We will begin our program in just a few moments. I'm going to give people a chance to log in. As always, you guys are going to be on mute for this call, so we can't hear you speak to us, but you can drop questions at any point in the chat, and we'll try to address those. We will also be holding 10 to 15 minutes at the end for a round robin of questions that you can submit in the chat. But for right now, just as a little bit of practice, because we do love getting questions throughout, feel free to drop in the chat your name, if you're running for office, what office you're running for, and also where you're calling from. And I'll start that off with Rob. And I'm just going to say that I am the field director here, and I'm calling from Cumberland, Maine. But go ahead and drop in your name, what you're running for, and where you're calling from as a way of saying hello. Jared, good to see you. Jared's our expert tonight. We'll be introducing him in just a minute. And I'm going to give it about 2 more minutes before we start off.
Woodstock, Georgia, Long Beach. I think that's California, right, Rob?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Long Beach, California. We see a campaign volunteer in New Jersey. Thank you for being here on behalf of your candidate. We were just talking about New Jersey and some particularly good stromboli I ate in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Los Angeles, good to see you. Another Georgia candidate here. Well, it's good to see you all here. This is I think, one of the more important trainings that we're going to be running over the course of this year. It is winning with data. So we're going to talk about how to analyze voter demographics, how to use data to do opponent research, and how to frame your messaging around some of the key issues. This is a really important training because voter data is one of the main offerings that we put forward at goodparty.org. And we do that because voter data is one of the best ways that you can make sure that you're maximizing the impact of your campaign overall. It makes sure that if you're running with limited resources, that you're using those resources as wisely as possible. And every tactic of your campaign can be enriched by using voter data. So that's a big part of why I'm so excited to see everybody here today. What are we going to cover? We're going to talk through understanding key voter demographics in your district. We're going to talk through identifying and researching your political opponents effectively. And we're going to talk about developing an issue-based strategy that makes sure that you weigh in and align with the voters' concerns. And then finally, we'll talk through how you can utilize goodparty.org's Pro Tier to segment voters to do targeted outreach in all of these different ways. So we'll dive right into this. I'm going to go ahead and let Jared, who is our expert this evening, introduce himself. Jared, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do at goodparty.org, and also your experience working with voter data?
Sure. Thanks, Rob. And hi, everybody. Glad to be with you all again tonight to talk about, like Rob teed me up for, I think, our most timely and valuable training to date, which is about how campaigns can leverage voter data to win and how to make use of the tool set that our team here at goodparty.org is making available to you all. So my background, not unlike Rob's, is in the political space. I've been running campaigns for well over 10 years now, all over the country, originally from New York, with stops in Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, New York City, where I originally am from, now in Miami, Florida, amongst a bunch of other different places. and have been working with goodparty.org really since the beginning. I like to say I was present at the creation, not maybe strictly speaking accurate, but I was one of the first folks to get on board the train here, and found the organization largely after going through my own political journey, realizing that our two-party system is very badly in need of a complete overhaul. And so the way that we do that is by helping support candidates for taking the bold step to run outside of that two-party dynamic, put tools that are affordable and effective in their hands, and start chipping away at the really the only two systems, the only two fish that have been in the game for a really long time. So I work with our team to help support candidates, help make sure that they understand our tools and make the highest and best use of them, and ultimately to help as many of them win as possible.
Awesome. Well, I want to get right into the discussion and into the training content because there's a lot to cover. And I think probably one of the best places to start is by talking about voter demographics and understanding voter demographics. And I guess even before we get in on that level, Jared, can you talk a little bit about how independents oftentimes struggle with access to
Yeah.
voter data? But then we'll get right into some of the key voter demographic pieces.
It's a great place to start. And I apologize because I didn't answer, I think, the second and most important part of your question originally, Rob, which is what has been my experience using voter data on past campaigns. And it really is something that not 100% of independent campaigns typically have access to, especially if you're running at the high levels. You oftentimes have to pay a pretty significant premium just to get the gates to open and get access to the information. And so I've been fortunate to have worked on some big ticket campaigns like races for the US Senate, US House of Representatives, some state legislative campaigns where voter data was budgeted for, and that gave me access to be able to get into the weeds and build strategies that reflected what was in the voter file. But for the most part, independent candidates really don't generally get access to this data unless they have the budget to pay for it. The two parties have a huge advantage. They've invested a ton of money over the years in building a data file, enriching that data with all of the different infrastructure and activities that they've supported for their candidates, and then oftentimes making it available to partisan candidates at a pretty steep discount. And so part of the reason that we really focus on making this data available is because we know how much of an impact it can have on elections and getting smarter about your communities, targeting your voters, understanding issues and opportunities to connect with people and where they are, and then putting it in the hands of candidates so that we can level the playing field. And that's, I think, in large part what we're going to talk about this evening.
Awesome. Well, let's get started and let's talk about demographics. You mentioned the importance of these voter files, but what type of information is actually inside of these files, and how can you use those?
It can be overwhelming in many ways because a lot of the voter data providers, they oftentimes oversaturate campaigns with information. And especially if you're a candidate on a small campaign, it's a little bit difficult to know where to start. And so the advice that we always give to our candidates is to really focus on the key demographics that you would use to make decisions, sort of regardless of whether or not you were running for office. In other words, what are the informations, the key points that you would have questions about in terms of your own community, and then attach some of the political variables into it a little bit later. So you can get pretty in the weeds, but first and foremost, we get information about people's names. It's important to know the names of the voters in your community, their contact information, like their address. Phone numbers are oftentimes available. Mailing addresses. So if you ever heard of direct mail, that's a big piece and relies on voter data to be able to target direct mail. And then you can get into sort of behavioral demographics. So once you know sort of who your voters are and where they're clustered, especially within your specific district boundaries, you can start to look at information and trends that exist within that group. For example, the voter registration of people in your community. It enables you to target people who are Democrats, Republicans, independents, or third-party voters, everyone, or even just a very tight filtering based on that specific variable. You can also look at age, race, gender, things like if someone is enlisted or has been enlisted in the military, the size of a household, all the way down to some sort of consumer behaviors or consumer pieces of information about income brackets and education. So there's a lot in there. And the first step is to really understand what are the core pieces of information that are the most important to your campaign that you would use to make decisions off of. And the very first one, I know I've thrown a lot about what's in the voter file, but the very and most important piece of information is someone's voting behavior. Have they voted in a recent election? Have they voted in the most recent election? When was the last time they voted? And have they just recently registered to vote and haven't had a chance to vote at all yet? And so once you have that information, you can start to create the buckets of different opportunities to reach your voters and to reach them in the most effective and specific ways that you can. For example, you wouldn't send a piece of outreach to someone who votes in every election, encouraging them to register to vote. And without that information, you might fall into that trap because you're just sort of shooting from the hip, or as campaign speech often goes, just flying blind. So first and foremost, getting that information right off the bat is hugely impactful. And then you can build a lot of strategies and tactics on top of that piece of information alone.
Awesome. And we have a good question in the chat here. How much do indies and other candidates pay for this data? They say sort of a round number on this. And I can start by saying that at the local level, candidates frequently will pay as much as $3,000 or $5,000 to get access to the voter file. At the state level, it can be $5,000 to $10,000. At the federal level, it can go up even higher. It can be a $40,000 expense that people pay to run for a U.S. Senate or House seat. And then when you get to the presidential range, it's even higher. But Jared, this is one of the reasons that our organization exists. We want to give this stuff away for free or as close to free as we possibly can. So Jared, can you talk about what goodparty.org charges in terms of this voter data?
That's exactly right. And so like Rob said, most voter files, not everyone's running in the same size district. Most voter files, there are two really important associated costs. It's the unit price of a record. In other words, each voter has a fixed cost. And if you're running in a much bigger district, your voter file is going to be much more expensive. And then there is also the cost of understanding the data. And most people who sell voter data in the political space will charge for their time to be able to help you interpret and understand what's in there. And a lot of people find value in that because otherwise you're staring at a pretty big spreadsheet and not necessarily knowing which way is up. And like Rob said very cogently, it's pretty expensive, especially if you're running upstream. At goodparty.org, we make the whole package of voter data available to those who pay the $10 per month subscription to goodparty.org Pro for a fixed rate of $10, regardless of the size of your district, regardless of how much time you need to understand that information. We'll make ourselves available to help you dissect what's in the data. And as we'll show you later, our tool will actually help you cut up the voter file using the best practices that we'll get into, so that you don't have to spend hours in a spreadsheet applying complex formulas and equations to be able to ultimately isolate the folks that you might be most interested in reaching out to. So it's an impactful offering, and we're going to get into all of it later. But I think it was a pretty good and timely question right up front. So thank you to the person who asked it.
Yeah. So let's begin to talk a little bit about strategy. Let's talk about how you can use voter segments to prioritize outreach. What are some of the segments that you tend to advise our candidates to prioritize during outreach and begin to look at?
Yeah, I think I alluded to it, but the first segment I encourage people to really form are these two buckets: those who are likely to vote and those who are unlikely to vote or less likely to vote, or maybe newly registered. And those two buckets, they are specifically zeroing in on the behavior of the voter that you're going to need in order to win your election. In most campaigns, the likely voters are sort of the first order of business, because you can operate with the assumption that these are people who will require, hopefully less convincing, to participate in your election in the first place. They might be aware that there's an election happening. They voted for it in the past. They might be familiar with the candidate. They might even just be more civically involved generally. That doesn't mean they don't get spoken to, right? They still will require reminders. They might require some education about the office and about who you are for sure. But you can focus your fire on what we call persuasion, and then ultimately get out the vote, and maybe less on informing them simply that there's an election taking place. And so that's the first bucket of voters that we often try and target. And you can get more in the weeds within that bucket based on your campaign's specific strategies. There are plenty of candidates, and in many instances, plenty of opportunities to target those unlikely voters, especially younger, newly registered voters. And while it may cost a little bit more in terms of time and energy and potentially resource, it can also be a really smart strategic rolling of the dice. Doing that oftentimes requires candidates to take some time to inform those voters that there's an election happening and why that election is really important to your community. But if you do that effectively and you put in sort of the time and really sort of mind the effort, once a voter responds favorably, you can tag them potentially as a likely voter. And the beauty of the strategy here and the yield is that this is a likely voter that only you've identified, because most campaigns oftentimes write off those folks who don't vote, especially in these off-cycle elections and off-year elections. I know we have candidates on this call. If you're running in, let's say, an April 1st election, that's not exactly peak voting season for folks, especially who just came out of a presidential election last year. So if you put in some time, you identify some people who are involved, but maybe didn't know that there's a race coming up, those are people that you can uniquely communicate with and feel confident are going to vote for you because you're probably the only one speaking to them in the first place.
Perfect. I want to reflect back some of what I'm hearing here. So the voter file has a lot of demographic information,
That's right.
age, gender, ethnicity, party affiliation, and voting history as well. You know, our offering, the way that it's different than, you know, a raw voter file that you might get from you know, the town clerk's office, is we also have voter propensity built in there. So you have a percentage likelihood that someone turns out. What you're just talking about is that with these different demographics, you can identify and sort of understand who your swing voters might be, who your likely voters might be, who the low turnout folks are. And by targeting them, you can actually expand the electorate. Can you talk a little bit as well about how to best align your message for the right audience? I think that's the one part that I want to make sure that you touch on before we
Sure.
move out of the demographic talk.
Absolutely. And it is part of sort of diving deeper into your two buckets once you've set them, right? In other words, once you know which voter you're talking to based on the likelihood that you assume that they have to vote, then you can start reflecting the unique parts of your candidacy to them, right? If you are a young person and you're really motivated to reach young voters, or if you're a maybe left of center or progressive person, or you have certain issues that you care about, you can use the voter file to make assumptions about the issues that folks in your community may care about. If you're running for school board elections, this is a practical example that we use a lot. We often will look for in the voter file for household sizes that are greater than 2 people. And the assumption there is that in the household, there's children. And that means that there are parents. That means there are kids who are probably in the school system. And the issue of a school board election might be much more impactful and important, even if they're not aware that it's happening. And so by using the voter file, you've identified folks who are going to be impacted by the election that you're running for, and you can communicate the importance of that office to them in a way that will connect to the concerns that you're assuming that they have.
Awesome. Well, let's move into talking a little bit about a topic I know is near and dear to your heart, and that's opponent research, essentially knowing who you're running against. What are some of the key areas to investigate when analyzing an opponent, and how does the voter file and voter data kind of factor into that approach?
Yeah, the voter file is a key tool in being able to not just frame up your own assumptions, but also when we talk about bases, how do you form, let's say, your base and then think about the base of your opponent? And that starts first and foremost with who you are running against. Many times there are folks in our space who are running against incumbents. And so you can make an assumption, for example, that people who voted in the most recent election for that specific office have a higher degree of familiarity with that opponent because they voted before. They may like him, they may not like him, but they have probably a degree of familiarity with him or her. Similarly, you can look for political affiliation. So let's say you're running against an opponent who is very vocally right of center. You can then match that voter file in your community against registered Republican voters or people who are likely to vote in Republican partisan primaries and say, okay, maybe these are people who are going to be predisposed to supporting my opponent. And in doing that, you can then reverse engineer it, right? You can say, okay, so these very likely Republican voters, they may not be my people if they're more affiliated with my opponent. The good news is now I know that, and I have folks who maybe are registered Democrats, independents, or more progressive or less likely to vote in this specific election, who I can reach out to, focus on, and tell my story to. So the voter file is really good at helping sort of make those assumptions. It's important to test those assumptions, but it's a good place to start and build a foundation that has got data involved to get a campaign off to the races.
Awesome.
The last thing I left it out. Sorry, the last thing is well, what exactly are we looking for when we talk about our opponents? And it's not just, are they registered to a party or do they affiliate with a party? It's also about doing your homework on who you're running against, which is not necessarily something that exists in the voter file, but a best practice for those candidates who are on the call is to familiarize yourself with your opponents. So look at their public statements. If they're a current office holder, especially, there's probably a public record of the job performance and what they've done in their local office. Social media is a pretty important place to look. And if they have a social media profile, that's a good place to spend some time, as well as news articles or even community-based sort of word of mouth pieces of information based on how well known they are to the community. And in doing that, you start to build sort of a bank of knowledge about the person you're running against. And that's where your assumptions in the voter file can be tested. So you're collecting all of this information. You're being thoughtful. You're saying, okay, these are the people in the voter file who are probably going to make up my opponent's base. And that is how you can start making decisions based on that information.
Awesome. And, you mentioned learning kind of about your opponent and their public statements, all of their kind of previous behavior. How can past election results help you to predict how an opponent is going to behave, what their strategy might be in the campaign where you're running against them?
It's a great question. And it speaks to why we look to the likely or unlikely voters in the voter file first. And this is especially true if someone has run before, whether they're an incumbent or they've run for a different office, or maybe they've run in the past and haven't had success. You can look to the people who voted in these elections and then compare it to the history of the candidate's performance before. So, for example, let's say I'm running against Rob for a city council seat, which is something I'm dying to do one day, but until we live in the same cities, it's probably not going to happen. And Rob is the office holder, and I have all these reasons why I want to run against Rob, but I'm a little intimidated by him. I look up his election and I see that, let's say 10% of the community voted and he got 700 votes out of 1,000. That means I know that there's 300 people who voted against him, and there's 90% of the community who didn't vote at all. So those 700 people, I'm going to assume they voted for Rob for a reason. I'm going to assume that the 300 who didn't voted against him for a reason. And then there's a huge swath of people that I know from the voter file who were not participating in that election last time and very likely won't this time without a good nudge from one of the two candidates. And so that's how you start to form a strategy. It's okay, I have a base, let's say, of 300 people. He has a base of 700 people. I've got some work cut out for me to find more voters. But the good news is there's a whole lot more voters who didn't participate than who did. And now I have to roll up my sleeves and go find them.
Awesome. And, we're talking about opponent research. One of the pledges that we ask people to take, it is to run a civil campaign, right? How can candidates use Oppo research ethically and effectively and not bring more ugly rhetoric into a space that is way too full of that to begin with?
Yeah, I think the advice I would give candidates, and I think it's one of the most important things to understand about an election, is that ultimately you're asking voters to make a choice when they vote. And the candidate who best communicates that choice and why the choice is important tends to have the most success. And being able to frame yourself as the better choice, even at the expense of the person you're running against, is not by definition like unethical or using or sort of mudslinging, right? It's important to be able to focus on record. It's important to be able to focus on the actions of the person you're running against, to lean into why you're running and why you're the best candidate in this election. And by virtue of that, explain why you're better than something else and why your vision for your community or the things that you care about are more impactful and aligned with what your community is looking for. Where the sort of fine line gets tipped and where people start to run into issues is when you lose sort of that perspective and start getting into a mudslinging contest and start calling people names or veering into the personal realm, right? Especially if you're seeing things on social media, which is louder and louder, it seems, every day. Someone says something nasty, and then all of a sudden you're in a 2 hour Facebook argument and things escalate. So for the most part, it's about framing the conversation, about framing the choice that you're asking voters to make, staying civil, focusing on actions and outcomes, and leaving the mudslinging, to the mudslingers, because as Rob said, we've got plenty of them already.
Yeah, I'm going to recap some of what you said in this section, and then I'm going to throw a couple of questions from the chat at you. So I'm hearing the importance of analyzing past election results by looking at the margins of victory, by looking at voting trends and areas of support that a candidate had in the past. You can learn a little bit about what the opportunities are, right? Like, okay, it looks like older voters really supported this incumbent, so I'm going to go to the empty space. I'm going to go towards younger voters, and then I'm going to target the local community college, for example. Could be a way that plays out practically. You should research the voting records and the policy positions if you're running against an opponent who has served, because there are inconsistencies and unpopular stances that you might be able to highlight and draw that contrast that reminds people that this is a choice. And on that note, Joe, in the chat here, he mentions we're directing the town budget, and we're finding discrepancies of what appears to be that they're not following the law. It's important to point this out to the electorate without negative campaigning. How can I do this? And I'd love, Jared, for you to respond to that and talk about how you can use the real data that's available to anchor this without going into that ad hominem attack.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is something that is not unheard of in the political space, and I think it's something that, when communicated directly, is something that really bothers voters. And there's plenty of ways to talk about it without going across the bow and getting into a negative campaign. And I think the first piece of advice, Joe, is to really take the time and be deliberative to identify with real confidence that the discrepancies that you're finding are what you believe them to be. And that could be something that you want to bring other folks into, really build a network of people who can help you analyze this stuff. And then when you get to the point where you're really confident that you've uncovered something pretty rotten, making a stink about it is important. I mean, at the end of the day, this is public dollars that are being misused or potentially even abused. I don't think any voter is particularly thrilled to learn that about their community. But if you stick to the facts, maybe go to a city council or a town council session and ask questions and see if there are good answers, because sometimes there might be. But if you're dissatisfied and you can get a record or a recording or create some content around the idea that your town council is not just abusing the budget potentially, but doesn't seem to be overly concerned with the community taking it upon themselves to figure out what the hell is going on, well, then you've got a pretty compelling campaign that you can run built on just that issue alone. And I think, like I said, voters are voters are pretty adamant that their tax dollars, no matter what side of the aisle people fall in on, no one loves to see waste and abuse of their hard-earned dollars. So that would be the lane I'd suggest to you, and the process by which I'd suggest you approach this.
Yeah, if I have anything to add, it would just be to simplify it down to keep it factual and make sure that you have receipts for something like this, right? You have to be able to show, and sometimes it's easier to just show the facts and let people draw the same conclusions that you had, rather than doing the editorializing for them. Great. I see a question from Lauren. It says incumbents win 95% of races at all levels. Are there new strategies you would recommend beyond flipping existing likely voters?
Well, the first thing that I think is adding some meat to this statistic, because we've heard it before, and it is true that incumbency is an advantage, but I think the folks on this call might be shocked to learn just how many of those races the incumbent wins just by signing up and no one runs against them. So if there's a strategy, sometimes simply mounting an opposition campaign is a good first step to ensure that the incumbent doesn't just get to coast to re-election. But if you're running in a head-to-head race with someone who is really campaigning and is used to campaigning, I think the big piece of the strategy is to look to voters who don't conventionally participate in the election that you're talking about. So like I had used in the example of myself in a hypothetical head-to-head matchup with Rob Booth, we know that, let's say 10%, 20% of any community is going to vote. The vast majority in most local elections are not participating. And so what does that mean? It means you've got a pretty deep pool of voters that you can look to and try and convince to turn out and participate in the election. And as we'll get to in the demo a little bit later, it's not enough to just have the information. The information is only as good as your ability to use it to take action. And so we have some ways that we help candidates do that, to take the data, to reach the voters that they think are the most valuable in terms of helping them get across the finish line in their election, and to take the actions that's going to help them reach out, understand about the election, and take ultimately the action of going to vote.
You kind of buried the lead on that slightly. 70% of elections are elections where the incumbent is running unopposed. And that is what is driving that number up. There are 350,000 local and state offices that default to the incumbent. And just by virtue of running, you're helping with that. Next question is from Jill. Jill writes, our small Chicago suburbs trustee election is April 1st, and all candidates run as independents. We like to keep things hyper-local and avoid national party platforms. Suburb tends to be more socially moderate to liberal and fiscally conservative. And Jill is finding that because of last year's election of Republicans, it really energized Democrats and it demoralized or are demoralized, and independents aren't sure what to think. Basically, how do you think that this last big presidential election is going to impact who comes out to vote in this first sort of big push of midterms?
To be honest, Jill, this is a question that a lot of folks around the country are waiting to get answers for. And for maybe the folks who are very, very political and follow elections really closely year over year, the election after a presidential election is generally viewed as the bellwether for the way the country is trending. So there are some really marquee races that are occurring later in the year, like the races for governor of Virginia and New Jersey. But there are plenty of races that are occurring well before then in cities around the country where we're going to learn how people on the ground are reacting to this new administration. And I think that for the folks who are on the front lines there, the advice that I would offer is to keep your ear to the grindstone and react without being overly reactive to what you're seeing and feeling. I think there's going to be a lot of insider baseball and sort of national shouting from the mountaintops as election results pour in over the course of the year, with a bunch of folks who are confident that they're reading the situation right. But in especially local elections, my advice is, again, there are going to be many people who don't vote. In fact, twice, three times, five times as many people who are not even aware that there's an election taking place on April 1st because they're still kind of caught up in the fervor from November of last year. And so there will be always people who are hyperactive and hyper aware and they're going to vote. I would encourage you to reach out and expand the electorate to look to people who maybe are not as jazzed up and all rah one way or the other about how the election ended last year, and who are ready to turn the page one way or the other with a new local election in the spring.
Yeah. I will say that I have had a number of people from both sides of the aisle who I have known for a long time doing political work reach out to me with more interest about independent campaigns than I have ever seen before. Practitioners who have spent years working on either side of the aisle, reaching out and saying to me for the first time, like, I want to find a way to work with independents more because clearly, like, the Democrats tell me that they think that their brand is damaged beyond repair, and Republicans, a number of them say this party doesn't reflect the party that I grew up wanting to be a part of. So I kind of would predict that we're going to see a surge in both independent candidates winning and independent voters voting their values rather than holding their nose to vote for the other party. So that's my hot take. We have lots of good questions popping up in the chat. One that I'll highlight because it actually is the perfect segue into the next section. How do you analyze the data to find those that you can motivate to vote, even if they don't usually? So how do you get that inconsistent voter to turn out? And that opens up a really great segue into the identifying and leveraging key issues section. So Jared, how can candidates determine which issues are most important to voters and then leverage those to turn out the inconsistent voters?
It's my favorite question. And let's start with the sort of elephant in that voter file. Like when you look at a voter file and you see, wow, 90% of the people in my community or 80% don't vote for city council or for mayor. The question I think that sometimes gets skipped is, why are they not voting? Because if voters are motivated and if they understand the election and they care, you're going to naturally see those numbers come up. And so if you think through the lens of, why is this person not participating, and don't write them off like the parties have proven they're really good at doing, right? If they look at the data, they say, this guy's not voting, this person isn't voting, forget them, and maybe we'll swing back at the end of the election. And if we have a couple of extra bucks in our back pocket, that's not an effective way to bring new people to the table. So instead, look to, with an open mind, those people who are not voting and assume there's a good reason for it. If you start with that mindset, I think you'll find there's plenty of information that's out there that you can connect the dots to. We talk about polling. I'm sure folks have seen or even on the news, the dissection of national polling. And what I think is sometimes lost is at even the local levels, maybe not for a small office where 500 people are going to vote, will you get an in-depth study about the specific issues in an election. But the trends that people care about do tend to get captured. So for example, we've done races where there's cities of about 10,000 people, and we found polling that have been produced online about an election higher up the ballot, let's say for Congress. And people will say, well, that poll's not relevant because they're not asking about the mayor's election. But what you forget is they're asking people who are voting in your community for those offices, and there are clues in there about what they care about. They may care about the economy, they may care about schools, they may care about safety. They're telling somebody something and shouting that these are the issues that they care most about. If you know that and you use it and you can apply it to your voter file, it gives you some hints and some clues about the issues that your community cares about. Even again, we're not suggesting that people should be talking about like the national fire button issues in a local election, but you can make some assumptions. If 80% of your community in their vote for Congress cares about public safety, there are layers to the city council that can have impacts on public safety or on schools or on your local budget if the economy is the hot button issue. And being able to communicate to those people and take it a level further, which is your city council sets your budget. Our city cares about their tax dollars or the economy working for them. The local level is where these problems are going to get solved. That's how you effectively communicate around issues that are shared and that matter. And so that all starts with assuming that people are not voting for a reason, not just because they're lazy, doing your homework, looking for data that exists online, or even just going around into your community and asking the question, what are the things that matter most to you? Looking into the data that we provide, and then actioning around it.
Awesome. And what sources can candidates use to track voter sentiment and emerging concerns, especially over time? We talk about polling, and polling is just a snapshot in time. And what's true on, in April might not be true come October.
Yeah, there are a lot of sources though. So you can, I mean, most public officials will do some degree of campaigning even when they're in office, whether they're holding town halls or community events. People are active online where they're commenting about the things that they care about. Uh, these are all great avenues to just keep abreast of. And so there are public, little things like Nextdoor has been a resource that our candidates have used to track sentiment in their communities. The public Facebook pages or social media pages of their elected officials. You'll see over time in the comments, public opinion being shaped. And it's a context cue for someone who's potentially running against, especially an incumbent, to take note of. And when we talk about sort of sentiment, I think there's two distinct things that are really important to understand, and they help people who are running for office shape how they communicate. And there are those two things, I should say, are like the performance of a community. In other words, how someone feels about the direction of their city or their community. Is it going in the right direction? Do they feel like things are on the right track? Or do they look around and say things are getting worse and it's on the watch of the person who's currently in government? That's a little bit more general. And oftentimes it's the thing that candidates lead off with, which is to say, I'm going to fix things because we're all tired of the way things are. And then there's the very specific issues. So people commenting online saying, you know what, I don't care about things that are going on all over the world or in other parts of the country. I just want, like, I'm upset that my eggs cost $9 and that I can't get my kids to school in under 45 minutes. Those are local issues potentially that you can tap into and target and talk about. And being able to track those issues along with the broader pulse of how the community is taking shape is how a candidate forms a really powerful and impactful message that resonates with people.
I heard you mention the use of Nextdoor and the Nextdoor app, and I'd be remiss if I didn't give Tyler Townsend a shout out, who I saw in the comments earlier. Tyler used Nextdoor really effectively last year to organize kind of basically some free texting on behalf of his campaign. So shout out to Tyler, who it's always good to see on these calls. A question from Packy McKibben. Are there bots or AI that can be used to search for voters that you're looking for?
It's a good question. I'm not necessarily, I mean, the space is developing all the time. I can speak to our AI, which is not necessarily scraping and identifying voters outside of the voter file. But we do have a tool that we're about to show you guys that can help you leverage AI to really effectively identify your voters. And that is because the voter files for every candidate who is in the goodparty.org pro level is connected to our AI, which enables them to filter, slice, dice their communities into those buckets that we were talking about earlier, and even ask our AI campaign assistant questions about the voter file that will help them when they're unsure about exactly what the opportunities are that are existing in that file. So we're eager to take you under the hood of that. And I think you'll find it's a pretty useful tool.
Yeah, I'll share an anecdote here. I think AI is increasingly becoming really powerful for these types of things, but there is a critical aspect of checking it against real life that is really important. And this even before AI was true. There was a sort of campaign horror story in some ways that ended up making its way into a movie that Jon Stewart made about a particularly liberal candidate who saw in the voter file a concentration of single women who named I think it was birth control as their number one issue. And so they sent a fleet of mailers, like 3 or 4 different mailers about being pro choice to these homes, only to find out that that high concentration was a convent. It was all nuns. So that blew up in their face because they looked at the data but didn't check it against what was actually true in that neighborhood. And as Jared said, that's how many votes they got because of that. Nuns. So recapping here again, some of what Jared just went over. Use polling data in community feedback to determine what the sort of top priority issues might be that you can then make sure that you're speaking to, because those issues, weighing in on them with your strongest message, that's what's going to turn out voters. And you can target different segments with different messages, right? If you see that you have a ton of young people in your district, for example, talking about what you're going to do to help them find jobs after they graduate, or what you're going to do to help lower the cost of the renters market, like those types of topics are important to young people, and you need to weigh in on those things. But if you find on the flip side that it's folks who are in the later stages of life, you probably want to talk more about some of the things that you're going to be doing on infrastructure, or the things that you're going to be doing to make sure that their cost of medication goes down, right? You have to meet the voter on the issues that they care the most about. And this polling data, it can point you in the right direction, but what you're actually going to do on that comes from you, and building that best message comes from you. And then, monitor the social media trends and local events to check against the assumptions that you're making on data. This is both quantitative and qualitative. So I know that we have some comments of people asking, can you show us what a voter file looks like? Can you give us a shot of what this looks like to use? And we're gonna go ahead and pull up a actual demo of how goodparty.org approaches access to the voter file. But Jared, how can the folks on this call, many of them I know already have access to these tools and are learning about how to use them in depth. But for anyone who doesn't have access to the voter file with us, how can they go about securing that? And then what are some of the tools available that makes this really effective?
Yeah. So like Rob said, the voter data is something that is included in the pro tier of goodparty.org's tools. If a candidate on this call has already opted into that tool for $10 per month, you'll see the screen that I'm looking at. If you haven't yet, the only difference will be a button that's right here in the top right corner of your screen that encourages you to upgrade to that pro level of tool. And it'll unlock the voter files, all of the different ways that you can cut up a voter file that you'll see here. And so I will show you a couple of things about the voter files in this toolkit. The first thing to point out is that when you upgrade to Pro, like I said at the beginning of the call, whether you're running for a high office of 10,000, 100,000, 250,000 people, or an office where there's only 1,000 registered voters in your community, the cost is fixed at $10 per month. And the first thing that you receive is the full voter file for the entire community. And when you click into it, it'll tell you exactly how many records exist in your voter file. So in this example, with my sample account, this is when I lived in Manhattan. This is roughly the size of a New York City Council district. You see it's 100,000 people. We've also done some work to cut up that same voter file with all 101,000 records into the appropriate shape and size for very specific actions that most of our candidates are looking to take, again, using the voter file to reach their voters. We have a door knocking voter file, for example, that includes the addresses of the voters in the file and leaves out some of the other information that is not pertinent to knocking on doors. Similarly, a texting voter file that includes the cell phone numbers and the bare minimum amount of information required to send a peer-to-peer message. Direct mail, which includes the mailing address, and digital advertising, phone banking, things that you can really target and load up into another tool to be able to reach voters online or via the phones. So this is your base voter file, and it comes in a bunch of different shapes and sizes, and it's specific in its intent to enable a candidate who maybe has never sent out a piece of direct mail before or has never sent a peer-to-peer text message to pull this file right off of the website. You can go into peer-to-peer texting, hit download, or as I'll show you guys in a moment, for texting, you can actually schedule a campaign right with our team of experts at goodparty.org through the product. But the idea is to make this simple, sweet, and easy. You can use the data and then get it out to make it work for you very quickly.
Yeah, so a great question in the chat here. Do we need to pay for the whole year to use this or just monthly? And it is month to month. So it is $10 for 1 month. If you find that you're not happy with it on the other side of it, then you're able to unsubscribe.
And most specifically, if your campaign is less than a year away, you can cancel after your campaign. We're not looking to charge people after their campaigns have ended unless they're successful and they want to continue to have use of the data. Like we said at the beginning of the call, not every person needs to use 100% of the voter records that are in their voter file. And it's really important to be able to leverage AI to be able to very quickly slice and dice your electorate. This is something that myself, Rob, we've spent years, many accrued hours that have probably turned into years of our lives, dissecting spreadsheets to isolate the voters that we're looking to target. And all now you have to do to be able to do that, the Rob one, I won't get those years back, is to create a custom voter file. And so the way you do that is you simply click the button that says create a custom voter file, talk about the channel that you're using in mind to get at your voters. So let's say we're going to use a text message voter file. And the purpose, whether it's get out the vote, persuasion, or voter ID, helps us understand what this file will be used for, specifically for communication, which I'll show you in a moment what that means. Let's say we're doing a get out the vote voter file. We have a series of filters. This is not 100% of what's in the voter file, but backed by popular demand, these are the filters that our voters, our candidates have told us are the most important to them, and I would agree, when it comes to filtering out and creating a voter file. First, you have the voter behavior of the folks in your community that we've sort of coded to help communicate likelihood to vote. So a super voter, for example, is someone who votes in 75% or more of every election going back several years, like 10, 15 years. And therefore, we have the highest degree of confidence that they're going to vote in these upcoming elections because they're hitting it more than 3 out of 4 races. Likely voters, similarly, they're a little bit less active, but still pretty active. Folks who are unreliable in that they vote maybe no more than half the time. And then folks who are the least likely to vote because they've never voted in more than 1 out of every 4 races going back several years. Lastly, you can also pull folks who are registered and who are newly registered and haven't had the opportunity to sort of get into this system of voting yet. The others are pretty, I think, self-explanatory, but they are important filters when you think about who is most going to resonate with your message in your community. You can apply political party filters. You can filter by age. You can filter by gender. Those things, so let's say I want to reach, super voters and the first-time voters who are independent, who are under the age of 25 years old, male and female. You can create that voter file and it'll produce a cut up portion of the electorate very, very quickly and give you the number of voters that are in that voter file. So let's say I use one that I created recently. I've just taken my voter file of 101,000 people and taken it down to just under 2,000 voters. A perfect size for a really targeted text messaging campaign. And you can do that for doors, you can do it for mail, you can do it for robocalls and for digital advertising. It's a really effective way to lock in those voters that you're really looking to test if they're going to vote and how they're going to vote over the course of your race. The last thing I will show you is how you can use goodparty.org's tools to actually send out pieces of communication. And text messaging is the one that we do the most. It's the one that we are currently set up to do the most effectively for our candidates, though we're adding more voter contact plans to the toolkit every single day. So let's say you want to send a text message campaign. You would go into your texting voter file and you'll see a button right here that says schedule a campaign. And in doing that, you can either upload your file or you can actually tell us sort of what you're comfortable spending based on your campaign budget. Let's say I want to spend $100 or I have a budget of $100. It tells me that I can send out 2,857 texts. I know that I have a universe of 1,900 in my back pocket, so I'll spend $75 or $70 to get to 2,000. If I didn't know that, you can create your voter file here and add any comments about when you want it to go out, that we give you an option to set a date. You can use a script that hopefully you've already done through our AI content building tool, or generate a new script if you haven't done one already. Let's say I have a saved script that I've already created, and I'm going to use my SMS election day script. You have to add a photo, and once you add a photo, you can also tell us when you want the date to go out, and that's all that the candidate has to do. My team will get notified as soon as you hit next. We'll reach out to you. We'll say, hey, we've confirming that we've received a peer-to-peer message from you that's going to go out on this time with this script to this pool of voters. We're going to load it up into our text tool. We're going to send you a confirmation with the final script in the event that there needs to be edits or for compliance or for whatever purpose. There is an associated cost for peer-to-peer messaging of 3.5 cents per text, though we do have a promotion where the first 5,000 texts are for free. And then once the campaign approves the message, if there's an invoice to be paid, the campaign pays the invoice. Our team will actually distribute and respond to those messages on your behalf or direct them to your website more often than not. So it's a really powerful and potent tool. To recap, you can go from 100,000 records to 1,900 in a snap of a finger. You can send and create a script that you want to use to text those voters right away. And then you can use our team's time and energy and our experience in sending messages by scheduling a campaign, and we can get it out the door for you in roughly 3 days is the lead up time that we ask, is 72 hours from the deployment date. Gives us time to make sure the I's are dotted, the T's are checked, and get all the texts out the door.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that, Jared. We're going to move into the Q&A section at this point, and we have lots of questions built up in the chat already here that I'm excited to get into. Lauren asks, how often does the data update?
Great question. The data for most of the states across the country, the voter vendors update the data roughly once a quarter. There are some instances where they update that data more frequently. Typically after an election, they edit that data right away, or they enrich that data right away. And then certain communities have legal standards that require the election agencies to update their records too. And when they do, the voter data providers update their records as well. But generally, we set the expectation of about 4 times a year that do the full voter files get updated.
Awesome. And Joe mentions your data looks like it's organized differently than anything that he's seen from his party. Is that true? And yeah, it definitely is. We tried to make this as intuitive as possible, Joe, and to make it as easy as possible to put that data to work. I know that some of the times the data, especially when it comes just in an Excel spreadsheet, it can be difficult to kind of understand what's there. And we've tried to make this as simple as possible, and even have some of those built-in suggestions for how to organize your data that Jared walked us through. Anything to add on that, Jared?
No, I think you summed it up. I mean, we're working to make this data as digestible and easy to use as possible. And frankly, if there's a concern that I've ever had with providing this information to candidates, it's sometimes the temptation to get too deep into the weeds in the information. And so I'll reiterate here, the data is only as useful as the candidate who's going to act around it, or the team that the candidate has built to act around it. And we always are working to make this data not just easy to acquire, but easy to use. And if a candidate gets this information and is spending hours and hours a day in a spreadsheet, while you're going to learn a lot, the flip side is you're not going to act on it and knock on those doors or schedule those texts. So my advice here is to certainly use the data, explore it, understand it, ask us questions. We're always happy to answer any questions that you may have, but don't set aside voter contacts or getting out into the community at the expense of sitting behind a computer screen.
The question is asked, do campaigns collecting donations pay income tax on the donations? And the answer to that is no. They are non-taxable gifts rather than income. Although, as I often say on all things financial, check with your local ethics offices, because all of the rules vary municipality to municipality, and I don't want anyone to get in trouble. You can always call your town hall and ask these questions to get the specific example, but generally speaking, no. What does it cost to work with your experts is asked here. And in terms of the texting that Jared mentioned, that's included in the $10 fee. We also, in our Discord community, our experts are in there day to day. And while they might not always be able to hop on one-on-one call with you, we answer as many questions as we get in the candidate channel as we possibly can on a daily basis. And that's all stuff that we do for free, as well as offering these calls every 2 weeks that we do. So we try to do it all for free or for that $10 when we absolutely have to due to FEC rules. But for the most part, the expert work is free. Anything to add on that one, Jared?
No, we like I had said at the top, the cost of our time is not something that we're very fortunate to be able to put ourselves in a position to service candidates without having to charge what can oftentimes be exorbitant consulting fees or campaign management fees, and that is something that is unusual in the political space and something we're really proud to be able to do for our candidates.
Marco asks, does the program offer script writing to help with messaging? And can we use voter files for campaign fundraising? And I know you showed the way that you can generate some of those scripts, but yeah, we have templates built in, Marco, for all sorts of handy campaign material. Our AI is trained. You can ask it to write you a press release, and it will do that in the best practices that reporters actually respond to. You can ask it to help you with writing a door knocking script. And a big part of my career has been in field and actually doing the door knocking scripting that convinces people to change their mind or to behave a certain way. We put all of those best practices into the AI, and we have templates for all of that. And yes, you can use the voter file for campaign fundraising, though I advise against it. In most cases, I think that fundraising typically is best to a warm audience and an audience that is familiar with you. If you cold call people for fundraising, you run the risk of alienating them, not only as a donor, but as a voter. If you go to someone and you ask for funds and they're not already enthusiastic about you, you might not only convince them not to give, but you might convince them not to vote for you. So that can work against you.
I'll piggyback off of that, Rob, because I saw a good question that Richard asked, which is any guidance or assistance on fundraising via brick and mortar events. And the thing that we would encourage people to do first and foremost is brick and mortar events are oftentimes the most effective way to raise money. Folks like to be invited to things. You can create an event, and promote the event. And if someone is well fed and potentially well lubricated, they might be more inclined to give, especially if they get to spend time with the candidate at the event.
Yep.
And there is a subtle distinction that's important to sort of underline, which is using the voter file to send a peer-to-peer message saying, "Hi, this is Jared Alper. Will you please give me $10? Thank you. Goodbye." I would agree 100% is not going to yield a whole lot and runs the risk, in fact, the high likelihood that you're going to upset some people. But if a message is, "Hi, this is Jared Alper. I'm holding an event at this local restaurant on March 25th. Would love if you could stop by. It's free to attend. The only thing I ask is you consider a contribution to my campaign." I think you'll find a very different outcome. And the reason is because you're not asking for money, you're asking for people to have a good time.
Yeah. Related to this, I'm a big fan of house parties, especially in the early stages of a campaign. So small events where you get one volunteer to invite over 5 of their friends or 10 of their friends, where you can have a kind of intimate version of this, and then build out of a series of those small house parties into these larger brick and mortar events. And later this month, we're going to be having a training specifically for candidates and volunteers on how to utilize that strategy. So keep an eye out for that. It's one of the ones that has been most frequently requested from our candidates, especially those who have November elections and a little bit more time to build out their base right now. A question from Ignacio, is voting behavior measured just based on even year elections in our voter file?
Great question. No, so we have access to in most states, if not all of them, I think the baseline is 10 years of the most recent elections. And in most states, we can go further back. I've seen data in the voter file that goes back into the late 90s. And so that does not just mean, 2024, 2022, 2020. We have data for the April, 2021 elections, the May 2017 elections. We have the information. There are instances where the data from the product itself sometimes gets trapped up in trying to pull elections that are not happening on a very easily and repeated cadence. So the elections that I think most people know are those even year November elections. And the ask in the event that you're running in a race and the data you're receiving doesn't quite match up to expectations, you can always reach out to us. We have it on the back end. We're always working to improve the delivery of the data to our candidates. And in the event that we have to go in and pull the data for your specific election that's happening on a different calendar, we're always happy to do it and deliver it to you as quickly as we can.
How do voter file match voters who move across state lines? This is a nerdy answer, and you're talking to the right nerds. There is an organization called the Electronic Registration Information Center, aka ERIC, and at least half of the states are members of ERIC. And ERIC automatically informs a state, all of the states that are members of it, when someone registers to vote who had previously been registered to vote in another state. So all of those states have the fastest reconciliation of that, but all states have a reconciliation process that stops people from being able to vote in 2 different states, or be registered in 2 different states. It sometimes can take time, including the election itself, for someone to be properly scrubbed from the rolls. But once you cast a vote actively in one place, you're scrubbed from your previous address.
And to answer how that pertains to the voter file itself, like whether it's through ERIC or through another means of data enrichment from the voter file, your votes travel with you. So I'm living this right now because I moved from New York to Florida pretty recently, and I'm an active voter in New York. I'm now registered in Florida. I'm in the voter file in Florida now, but it does have me as a voter for all of the ballots that I cast in New York. So your votes travel with you. The data, it's especially powerful for those new move to city voters, because it'll understand your voting behavior even if you haven't actually cast a ballot in a new district that you happen to have moved to.
Mm-hmm.
Great question.
Lauren mentions that the data is missing one of the largest segments of citizens, which are non-registered voter eligible residents. So people who could be voters, but just aren't registered to vote. There's not really data available on this. They asked, is there a way to get that data from Good Party? What we can offer are strategies around how to register those people and how to reach out to those people. But Jared, any thoughts on non-registered voter eligible residents and the best way to target those people?
Yeah, it's a thorny problem that many campaigns and strategists and data-oriented people have thought about for a while. Oftentimes, the best solution is honestly to run what we call a voter registration drive on your own. And especially in a small community, that's something that you can do at a pretty reasonable scale pretty quickly. It is takes time and it takes energy and it takes resource. The concern I almost always have when you're talking about people who are not registered to vote is that there's no anchor for the data. So when you go to the DMV, you get a driver's license, you register to vote, you're in the system from the state, which generally tends to be the most reliable foundation of information about any particular voter. Without that, a lot of times the data can be unreliable and they're sort of guessing and trying to match people up within a pretty complicated layer of information. And so I've seen folks try and buy that data. I wouldn't certainly recommend it just because I don't have the highest degree of confidence that it's worth the investment. And it's for that reason, it's not in our system too, is we want to make sure that we're giving the highest quality information to our candidates and not lead them down rabbit holes.
We're asked, is this a for-profit organization and will you work for other than independent campaigns? And we are a public benefit corporation. We only work with independent campaigns, and we define independent pretty loosely. It is essentially to be independent under our definition, you can't be a member of the two major parties, Republicans and Democrats, or their fundraising machine. That's our hard stop on that. There are lots of tools available to Democrats and to Republicans, and they have gatekept those tools and stopped them from being available to anyone who doesn't take their pledge and sort of fall in line ideologically. And for us, number one, we want to provide tools to the people who have not been on equal footing. Number two, and this would disqualify most Democrats and Republicans as well, we ask that you're people powered. So a majority of funding for your campaign has to come from individuals rather than special interests, rather than banks, rather than lobbyists. And then we also ask for an anti-corruption pledge, remaining transparent to constituents, as well as a civility pledge. So that is sort of our user agreement. And the independent part of this is a really important part for the organization. We were founded to try to make people matter as much or matter more than money in politics. And that's at the backbone of what we're doing. So we provide these tools for free or as close to free as we can. And we do so at a loss because there's no laws against being bad at business. But we do not provide them to Democrats or Republicans. Do you provide an editor for text messages? The AI tool is a really potent partner when it comes to editing. Will the team radio button be active? I don't know if I understand this question. Jared, do you have a thought on that one? And Rodney, you might be able to ask, maybe refine if not.
No, so we have a bunch of sort of planes that we want to get on the runway and help help candidates reach their voters where they are. Radio is not the newest form of voter contact, but it is still an effective way, drive time radio to inform people that you're running. We are in the process of adding more tools to the toolkit. So right now we have texts, we have these robo dials where we have a partnership with a canvassing application, and we're always looking to add more. I can't promise that radio is going to be the very next one on deck. We've got a couple of different irons in the fire on the voter contact front, but the hope is to get a pretty diverse slate of ways to reach voters, because in every community there's different opportunities and different makeups of people, and we're trying to provide all of the different avenues to our candidates to help them reach their voters that are most specifically in need of contact in their town.
Margaret asks, how many texts do you recommend targeting towards each person?
Great question. We generally recommend, and I think the size of your district is always the driver of how many texts you send, and also budget, just candidly, is a big factor in making campaign decisions. So I say this understanding that everyone's a little bit different, but the standard answer, and I'm pretty confident in the impact of these messages and how frequently and the cadence in which they should be sent. We generally recommend between three to four messages in that get out the vote phase of your campaign. And we had candidates do that last year to success. We're certainly running that playbook again on that front this year.
Yeah, and broadly speaking, we tend to tell people that if you're targeting an undecided voter or a voter who you think is uh, up for grabs, the best practice is to communicate with them 3 to 5 different ways over the course of your campaign. And this is sort of like a basic marketing principle as well as a basic campaigning principle, where whether it's a door knock or a text message, or they hear you on the radio, or they see your ad someplace, you want to be able to touch those people 3 to 5 times with your best message. And that's what it takes to be able to convince them to get out and vote for you. And to Jared's point, the game of campaigning is really figuring out what blend of resources do you have to get to those 3 to 5 touches. If you have a campaign that has no money at all, you're going to have to over-index on what you can do with volunteer support, and what you can do with your own shoe leather. So you would try to talk to those people 2 times at the doors rather than going and talking to them just once, because you can't supplement with some of those paid efforts, right? But it's still possible. You can still win that campaign. It's just going to take a little bit more shoe leather.
And
Um,
I'll expand on that just quickly because we actually the magic number is something that I think a lot of political people have taken as gospel, and it's rooted in our experience. But we at the end of last year, having done 6,600 elections, really did try and study and get the best answer to the question of, well, what is the magic number in terms of contacting your voters? And what we found is that candidates who did 3 times, at least 3 times the votes that they needed to win. In other words, if you need 1,000 votes to win your election, you did 3,000 votes or a little bit more. The odds of your winning were 71%. And so that is our standard in terms of trying to get as close to 100% as possible. Obviously, we don't say if you hit your voters 3 times, you're done. But that is a really strong foundation to build on, and it's something we're going to continue to test. But that's the basis of our recommendation, is that from last year, 3 times yielded a 71% win rate, and that's what we are using as the foundation for this year as well.
um, are voter designations like super voter based on turnout in off-year elections, national elections, or all elections?
So it's called voting performance in the voter file. And so it factors in all of the elections that you have data for. If you have data going back 10 years, you had to have voted in 75% of all elections that took place in those 10 years. So it factors in off-cycle elections, factors in off-November elections. It's the races that are available to every member of the community to vote on.
Can analysts use your database for research and public, political, and sentiment backgrounds? It is currently just for candidates, and we do require proof of candidacy to be able to use our tools. Skipping on down. I think we are reaching the end of the question backlog. Okay, how do you maintain accurate voter data? Often phone numbers are no longer in use. When we pay for texting, there are invalid text messages. Are those refunded? On texting with our service, we only charge for the messages that are delivered. So if it's an invalid number, if we get a bounce back, that is not included in the final charge. But Jared, do you want to speak to how both candidates and also how we on our end help to maintain accurate voter data?
Yeah, so when we upload voter data into the tools that we use to distribute, whether it's a phone call or a text message, there are means of checking and scrubbing the numbers. So it'll look for disconnected phone numbers. It'll look for phone numbers that haven't been used recently or on the do not call list. There are means to try and protect against numbers that are still in the voter file that may no longer be in service. In complete candor, there are instances, they don't happen frequently, where the voter file will say, hey, we're reaching out to Derek, and the number will be associated with either someone who may be a spouse or someone just whose number they got overlapped with or changed recently. That does happen. It's not a frequently occurring situation, but it is something that you run into from time to time, which is the voter cell phone numbers getting their wires crossed.
Yeah. Rodney asked a very technical question about our tools. So you can tell Rodney's been using our tools. Will the team option be added back actively soon? So we used to have the ability for like a campaign manager to log in on the back end of your tools. Rodney, you maybe were one of the only people who liked that feature. We had very low tool usage on that, unfortunately, and it was so it's actually been removed as a feature. It is single login for single candidate at this point. I'm sad to break it to you. We let it run for basically all of last year, and there were I think maybe under a dozen people out of the 6,000 who used it that way. Do you provide resources to help expand messaging to mainstream media outlets like news, public event meetings? Yes, we do a lot of practical training on that. There's actually training coming up in this curriculum in our biweekly training series where we will talk about how to work with the media. We also have a lot of tools on the AI side and on the template side. Press releases are your best friend when it comes to something like that. And being able to write a well-crafted press advisory and press release, as well as developing a relationship with the reporters who cover politics in your political beat, go a really long way. So we can offer some advice on that. We are also adding more and more information to the AI in the dashboard. So I would, Marco, ask you to log in and ask that AI for some pointers on how to do that in the interim. But we will be having a full training on that topic coming up soon. Last call for questions. We are right on time so far. So last call for questions. For those of you who are interested as well, I'm going to drop the link here. This is how you can gain access to the voter data that we just did a demo of. This is the pro level sign up login. So definitely, if you are not already a pro candidate, this is how you can leverage all of this voter data. And I'm also going to drop the Discord link. Discord is our online community where our candidates are able to support each other, ask each other questions, and also have around-the-clock access to our team. We also have volunteers there who are on call to be able to chip in and help in any way that they can. They do lots of things like offer design support. They can help with research. I saw a lot of people this past week doing OPPO research on behalf of candidates. So a good way to get access to remote volunteers. And then last but not least, we will be sending an email with a recording of this call, as well as a deeper survey that helps to shape calls that we'll be doing in the future. We value your input and your feedback on how these trainings went. And as well, we're always interested in hearing from you on what trainings you'd like us to cover in the future. Seeing no additional questions, thank you guys for being here. This was a wonderful way to spend a Thursday evening. I see from Michael Evans, he says the data I received was up to 2022. Is data available for 2024?
It's coming. It's coming. It's a frequently asked question and something that I would love to have a better answer to, other than the states are still packaging their voter data. Some states have it, some states are still behind schedule. Generally, we see the data come in by the end of the first quarter at the latest after an election. And so my sincere hope and expectation is that by the end of this month, every single state will have voter data from last year's election. And we're operating with that expectation as well on our end.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you all. This has been lovely. And we will see you in 2 weeks for our next training, which the training topic will be developing your core message. So we talked about targeting this week. We're going to get into how you take the right message to the right voter and how to craft a clear and consistent message to make sure that when you put that message in front of these voters that you're targeting, it actually has the desired effect. So looking forward to getting into that message development and sort of communication themed training in 2 weeks. Until then, folks, this has been a lot of